Welcome to the Neutral Ground Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Meyer. This is part 2 of our look at postmodernism. In the first video, we did our best to kind of flesh out a bit of postmodern theory proper. We talked about the skeptical eye that postmodernists glance toward the world, and we talked a bit about the positives and negatives that come out of postmodern theory. Today, however, we're going to look at the popular culture side of postmodernism. Mostly television, because that is the medium by which postmodernism really kind of came into its own. Now, postmodern culture is also predicated on the idea of skepticism. But unlike the actual proper theory of postmodernism, I would argue that the cultural side of postmodernism is much more palatable to the public, and yet potentially more subversive. And I know some of you who probably listen to other podcasts about this, you're probably thinking, what? No way. Right? Because a lot of major cultural critics today talk about how the postmodern theorists are the ones at the source of all of our upheaval today in culture. But, well, let me make my argument for why I don't think we should completely dismiss the cultural aspect of this as well. Again, however, I want to also remind you, don't rush to judgment about hating or loving any historical movement by itself. Remember, there are still both good and bad aspects to all of these historical movements. We just need to break this information down and try to parse out what we want to take with us into the future, right? What can kind of most help us, and what we should probably try to leave behind. And by the end of this episode, we're going to be knocking at the door of our current historical movement, neo-modernism. So, all that being said, let's kind of get right into it. Now, I want to begin this episode with an anecdotal story. And I'm not trying to pass this anecdote off as any kind of grand piece of evidence. However, I do think that it demonstrates a part of postmodernism that we're going to have to deal with a lot in this episode. So about 7 or 8 years ago now, I visited a modern museum of art on a trip in Massachusetts. And, I mean, to be completely honest with you, I'm not a big modern art fan. I tend to prefer the much older stuff, quite honestly. But I do like museums a lot, and so if I'm ever in a particular city or town or whatever that has a museum, I'll tend to go if I'm on a trip, because I'm just always interested. And as I'm walking around and looking at all the exhibits, I'm not, really connecting with anything. No surprise there. But of course, I can always appreciate the work that went into a lot of the exhibits. I've learned as I've gotten older, especially, that I can not particularly like a piece of art and yet still see a kind of greatness in it. So I'm open to great art, even if I don't like it. I went into one room with small glass enclosed exhibits, basically dioramas, and as I'm walking around, I start to hear this kind of faint sound of sniffles. And I'm looking around to try to find out what's going on, and I see a woman staring at one particular exhibit. And she's just crying. And I got this feeling in my stomach that these were not positive tears. So I went over just to make sure that she was okay. And I asked if she was all right, and she just kind of shook her head as if almost like a spell had been broken in me talking to her. And then she kind of looked at me and said something like, yeah, it's just so sad. I just feel sad from this. I looked at the exhibit, and it was the following. Now, forgive me, as this is going to get a little graphic here. There were slugs, not real ones. In fact, they almost kind of looked cartoony, like really bright colors and whatnot. And the artist had framed the crucifixion of Jesus using slugs. Now, that's not the end of the description, but let's stop there for a moment. Had the artist just left it at that, you could make an argument that the artist was perhaps trying to tap into some kind of idea that the yearning for a Messiah is built into various species, right? Almost at a DNA level. Or you could propose an interesting enough conversation around the idea that if animals achieved human levels of discourse and consciousness, or human levels of at least social interaction, you would eventually end up repeating a kind of scene like the crucifixion. Because again, there is this simultaneous kind of yearning for salvation while also propagating destruction, I think, within the human condition, that you might be able to make an interesting enough argument or discussion out of what that would look like in other species on Earth. Now, I could have been fine enough with those two interpretations, and I think if used correctly, again, the art could have maybe prompted some interesting enough thought and discussions. But that's not the end of the description of the exhibit. On the backs of each of the slugs, even the one being crucified, were penises. Now, for me, any potential kind of connection with the exhibit went right down the tube there. Even though, of course, because I'm kind of a trained rhetorician and I can, of course, develop arguments, with the best of them, yeah, we could have spun off discussions of maybe, I don't know, phallocentric kind of stuff, but that wasn't what came to me. What came to me was something else. I kind of just stared at it in a stupor, and I soon realized, I think, why the woman was crying. Now, I'll come back to this anecdote a little bit later on in the episode. When we look back on the culture being produced at the end of World War II, an interesting narrative, I think, begins to emerge through a fairly new medium, television. When we think of television in the 50s, we tend to, I think of like sugary sweet shows that promoted family values and threw in some fairly innocuous hijinks for our entertainment, right? Think Lucy, right? I Love Lucy and Ethel on the candy assembly line, trying to, wrap up the candies that are coming down as so quickly they can't kind of keep up. That still remains, I think, some of the best comedy you can find in any episodic show. But I think what television did better than even movies, particularly, is reflect shifts and fissures in how popular culture in America viewed the surge of postmodernism. In some ways, television, I think, has always been a tool for postmodern appeal. Take the previously mentioned I Love Lucy show, right? A show with a woman as a lead, a woman who is adventurous, one who feels as though she can do anything. And even though kind of much of what Lucy tries to do on the show is an abject failure, she nonetheless tries them. She has a genuine sense of agency there. And in 1956, you have the Nat King Cole show, the first show on television hosted solely by an African American. If you're younger and unfamiliar with the dulcet tones of Nat King Cole, you're doing yourself a major disservice. His songs like Mona Lisa, Unforgettable, LOVE, love, those are treasures of our culture as a species. And they're fantastic and I dare say when you're finished listening to the podcast here, go look it up and just kind of enjoy that beautiful music. Now, I bring both of these examples up because they were put forward as postmodern attempts to destabilize a largely monolithic structure of entertainment so that more individuals would have opportunities to fully participate in that culture. During postmodernism, you can make an argument that television had three purposes, really: one, to entertain; two, to disseminate information; and three, to challenge mainstream narratives. Think about shows like All in the Family, The Jeffersons, Maude, and then even The Simpsons, which probably seems pretty tame by today's standards. However, I'm old enough to remember when buying a t-shirt with Bart Simpson on it pretty much guaranteed that you were going to be sent home from school for being some kind of agent of chaos. Now, I never had a Simpsons shirt, but I absolutely remember a kid that I went to school with when I was younger who was forced to go to the bathroom and turn his shirt, his Bart Simpson shirt, inside out for the remainder of the day. Why was The Simpsons considered so rebellious? Well, because it challenged the narrative of the perfect family, and it elevated the rambunctious Bart to a level of like an anti-hero. This was actually really genuinely frightening for some people who believed that decent culture was under attack. But I would argue that The Simpsons still made efforts to put forward what we would call family values, right? Homer and Marge loved their kids, and the siblings fought with each other, but they also fought for each other. I remember when the episode where Lisa brings cupcakes to school, and there's bullies and they're trying to take her cupcakes and whatnot, and Bart stands up for his little sister, and he gets his butt handed to him for it by the bullies. What the Simpsons did do, though, is they kind of paved the way for more adult cartoons that would push the postmodern values, I think, to the edge of cultural sanity. Specifically here, I want to bring in Family Guy. Now, Family Guy is an interesting case study for postmodernism and for me, because I think it encapsulates both the good and the bad of late postmodernism. We've already talked about the good, right? Destabilization and challenge of dominant narratives really can be good for the social evolution of the species. It can help prevent tyranny in democracies as well. However, when you seek to destabilize all narratives, as postmodernism does, you can't really be surprised when the bonds that once connected human beings to each other just kind of begin to break down and create fractures. Now, I'm going to make a nuanced point here about Family Guy, one that I've used in class before to challenge my students. There's a scene in Family Guy where the neighbor Herbert, and if you're familiar with the show, you know that Herbert has a descriptor to his name, Herbert the pervert. Herbert is asked to watch over the kids, Meg and Chris. And Meg and Chris are both, they're not children, they're both in high school, but they're young. Now, Herbert is a pedophile. That's openly known in the show. It's not anyone reading into the character. It's just known, a known fact. In this episode where Herbert is watching the kids while Peter and Lois are away, Herbert tucks like 15 or 16-year-old Chris in bed, and he reads Chris a bedtime story. It's, really a cringy moment for the audience, right? Because we know what we're seeing is wrong. Something wrong is going on here. And then we get our postmodern moment. After Herbert finishes whistling the theme to Peter and the Wolf, Chris just kind of blurts out, "Are you a pedophile?" And the typical response that I get from students is laughter. And not uncomfortable laughter. Genuine laughter. But let's break this scene down a bit to better understand how the creator of the show, Seth MacFarlane, gets us to laugh here. Now, the whole time throughout this scene, the audience is placed in a kind of tension, and with each passing second, that tension is building energy within the body. We know it's wrong, what we're seeing, but we continue to watch because we can feel secure in the fact that the genre of the show is comedy. We know that the tension is going to be released. We just have to wait for it. That doesn't happen if the genre is a more serious one. So we wait. And we allow that energy, that potential energy, to build up within us. Then when Chris utters his question, "Are you a pedophile?" that's our moment to release the anxiety, the tension that we've built up the entire time. And we take our chance to release that tension through our laughter. But here's the challenge that I give my students, and I'll pose it to you as well. What are we laughing at? Now, I'm not asking this question in order to try and make anyone feel badly. That's not the purpose here. I ask the question because I want people to see what this level of postmodernism has actually produced within us as a people. Invariably, I get students who say, "We're laughing at the awkwardness of the situation." And probably many of you as well are saying this. To which I say, what is the situation? Say it. Say it out loud. And the students can't do it. Because there's no way around the inevitable point. We're laughing at a pedophile in the bedroom of a young man. Postmodernism has gotten us to laugh at this situation. Again, I don't do this to try and shame anyone for laughing. I laugh at Family Guy. I laugh at irreverent jokes. I am most certainly not holier than thou in any way. But I do think it's important that we understand what historical movements can actually produce within us. And you might say, well, isn't that more of a cultural movement than history? Sure, okay, but don't dismiss the power that historical movements have in shaping our cultural shifts. And then there's South Park. South Park is without a doubt the most successful form of satire, since Jonathan Swift gave his modest proposal that we should eat children in order to fix problems of overpopulation, hunger, and poverty back in 1729. And if you're not familiar with Jonathan Swift's essay, A Modest Proposal, that's a must read for everyone. Now, people often confuse, I think, satire with parody. What Seth MacFarlane does with Family Guy and in a lot of his other shows as well is mostly parody. I think when he tries to do satire, it falls flat quite a bit, right? But he is wonderful at parody. And parody is kind of when you mimic a particular event, idea, or even a style, or even a person, but you give it your own amusing take. So a good example of parody in Family Guy is when the son Chris is in a store and suddenly he's grabbed when he's trying to get milk and he's brought into a music video. And the music video is Aha's 1980s hit Take On Me, Take On Me. That video, right? And MacFarlane puts Chris in the actual video from the 1980s, and we're seeing this Family Guy character, playing the role of the lead in the music video. And it's actually really funny. And and really artistically well done. And so I give McFarlane a lot of credit. He is kind of a master of parody. But satire requires social commentary, and it's incredibly difficult. It's a really difficult art form to pull off effectively because the outlandishness of your proposal must make logical sense. People were really taken aback by Jonathan Swift's modest proposal of eating children because he included not just an explanation of how it would reduce overpopulation, but he included like math to help show that it could provide poor families with a means of producing assets that could be converted into money. It's horrible. There's no way around that stinging feeling of reading a modest proposal the first time. And of course, his point isn't that we should actually eat children. His point is that we were consuming people anyway. So he kind of says, let's just do it for real then. Now, South Park really thrived in postmodernism because it did kind of what I talked about with Family Guy. Oftentimes, it lifted the veil of what postmodernism was producing within us as a culture and said, look at it. Stare at it. Be aware of what is there in front of you and come to grips with what we are becoming. The episode that I always think of with this is the Britney Spears one. At the time that the episode came out, she was struggling with her mental health a lot, and people were on the internet calling her fat, which is, I mean, come on, that's ridiculous. And talking about how she really needed to just kind of go away, and that the populace we were through with her, essentially. So in the South Park episode, she's aware of all of this, and she takes a shotgun and she blows half of her head off. Like from the nose up, no brain, nothing. And of course, because this is South Park, she's not dead. This doesn't kill her. Instead, she spends the remainder of the episode just trying to get away from the public, who really seem bent on kind of finishing the job. Everybody wants to take pictures of her and make fun of her and get money for these pictures. Even the boys in the show, right? Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman, until they become aware of her humanity, essentially. And once they come in contact with her humanity, it changes and they kind of just want to help her get away. So what happens? What's the show actually about? Why is everybody after her in the town? Well, in the end, we learn that the episode is about how the town needs Britney to kill herself in order for the crops to grow for the harvest. South Park utilizes culture from our past, right? Human sacrifice, and shows us how we're essentially still sacrificing people. Now, can you make the argument that she entered the public sphere on her own? Absolutely. Sure, that's fine. But does that take away from the fact that she still is a human being? Does it make it any better that there are actually people not simply even just rooting for her to fail, but almost rooting in a way for her to be erased, to actually like just die and move on already so that we can move on to the next big thing? There's no way around the ugliness that's there in us. And what's interesting about South Park here is that South Park actually uses postmodernism to fight against itself. It says, let's destabilize the dominant narrative by actually, what's the right word here? Not just embellish it, but amplify it is probably the better word. We're going to amplify this dominant narrative. in order to try and jar people out of this kind of postmodern haze. And that's what made South Park such a force to be reckoned with in postmodernism. Now, one of the problems that we're seeing here with late postmodernism is that it demands you sacrifice sacred space. In fact, in order to propagate itself, it must attack sacred space. It needs to remove it in order to work within that tandem of building tension and then waiting for the release. Now, can this be used positively? Well, I think so. I mentioned in a previous episode that stand-up comedy has a boom, of course, that takes place in postmodernism. And there is a connection there, right? It's not by chance. It's not as if stand-up comedy or people standing up in front of an audience making jokes had never happened before postmodernism. But of course, this becomes like a genuine, bona fide career in postmodernism. Stand-up comedy also requires the sacrifice of sacred space so that it can freely explore like all the ideas and idiosyncrasies of the human experience. It takes things that we want to hold as sacred, like marriage, relationships, religion, and it destabilizes them by building tension and then promising a release from that tension. At least the really good stand-up comics do this, right? And here's the thing about why I think comedians tend to be fairly open, actually, about kind of who they think is a good stand-up comic and who isn't. It's because there is a kind of science and psychology that plays in the background. It's not just that idea of the importance of building up the tension and then the release through the joke. If you've ever been to a bad stand-up comedy show, oh man, the major problem is that they build up tensions but never provide an actual outlet for release through laughter. And if you don't have laughter as the release point, that tension still has to come out in some fashion. It has to come out physically. And if it doesn't have laughter, then it usually comes out through what? Anger or frustration. It's why people get so angry and annoyed when a comedian is bombing and not making them laugh, because there needs to be that outlet, the release of that tension. So I think a fair question is, how does stand-up then differ from the example of Family Guy that I gave earlier? Surely you're thinking there are comedians who joke about serious topics. And the answer is, of course, yes, right? There are. Anthony Jeselnik is one that comes to my mind. Daniel Tosh, I think, is another one that does this too. The difference for me is that the stand-up comedian presents a fully enclosed show. In other words, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to the show. And when the show ends, the performer ends as well. In other words, that particular individual who stood up and gave the jokes almost ceases to exist. And that performer becomes their individual everyday selves again. There's no extension of that performer after the show. Whereas with an episodic TV show, there is no real end. There is the closing of the show, right? The show obviously does end itself, but psychologically, we extend that show's world's ethos, I think, beyond the end of the episode. It carries over until the next week when a new episode begins. And I don't think we realize necessarily psychologically that we stay in that ethos throughout the entire week. Or even if we're binge watching, right? It just kind of continues from episode to episode. Now, I openly admit, I'm not sure if what I just said makes complete sense. It's not always easy to put these ideas out there without kind of people in front of you to just bounce off of. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't find stand-up comedians to necessarily be subversive in any way, because subversiveness is not funny. Subversiveness is in some ways antithetical to what the comedian is trying to do, its purpose. The comedian's purpose is to move your thinking to as close to consciousness as possible in order to make us laugh, right? To take the little things that we do subconsciously, right? Like take again, like marriage, right? How many stand-up comedians joke about marriage? Okay. And what does the stand-up comedian actually do? It takes the things that we've sort of automated in marriage and it makes us be hyper conscious of it. Something like doing laundry, right? They make a joke about how, like, I have to do laundry and it just makes us hyper conscious of these things that we tend to sometimes put on autopilot to make them kind of just in the background that we do. Whereas I don't think that TV or movies, I think TV and movies, there is a kind of reward, in a sense, for being subversive. And in some ways they do it because I think we've come to a point where we almost expect it, and dare I say even want it to a degree. And again, when I say subversive, I don't mean in any specific leaning, right? Like I don't care subversively left, subversively right. I don't care about that. What I'm saying though is I think in some ways we've come to expect it. Subversiveness in that entertainment media, TV and movies, let's say. Whatever it is, whichever kind of subversiveness it is. And in truth, that can wreak havoc on our psyches. So what do we do with all of this information that I've proposed here, right? When we bring this information to our neutral ground, what exactly do we learn?